The rain came down like bullets from heaven. Clara Reed ran through the Wyoming darkness, her torn dress clinging to her legs like wet chains. Each breath burned. Each step sent pain screaming from the bullet graze on her left shoulder. Blood mixed with rain, sliding warm down her arm. Behind her, hooves thundered closer. A gunshot cracked through the storm. The bullet whistled past her ear and buried itself in a pine tree with a sickening thud. She didn't scream. She didn't look back. She ran straight toward the only light she could see, a single lantern glowing in the window of a lonely ranch house at the edge of the valley. The cabin of Jack Harlan. They called him the man without a heart all across Silver Ridge. A man who spoke little, trusted no one, and buried his past so deep that even the wind couldn't dig it up. Clara's boots slipped in the mud as she reached the porch. She pounded on the heavy wooden door with both fists. "Open, please. Open the door." The door swung inward. There he stood, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing nothing but an old shirt and trousers, a Colt revolver already in his right hand. The lantern light carved hard shadows across his face. His eyes were cold steel. For one terrifying second, Clara thought he might shoot her where she stood. Instead, he stepped aside just enough for her to stumble inside. She fell to her knees on the rough pine floor, water pooling around her. Her whole body shook. Blood continued to seep from the wound on her shoulder, staining her dress crimson. Jack closed the door behind her. The sound of the storm dulled, but the thunder of hooves still echoed in her ears. She looked up at him, rain and tears streaming down her face. Her voice came out raw, desperate, and shockingly clear. "Marry me. Right now. Tonight." Jack's grip tightened on the gun. He didn't speak. "Or shoot me dead," she continued, her voice cracking but steady. "Because if Buck Sawyer finds me, he'll do far worse than kill me. I have no other way out." The silence in the cabin was heavier than the storm outside. Jack Harlan stared down at the soaked, bleeding girl kneeling at his feet. His jaw clenched. A muscle ticked in his cheek. He had lived alone on this ranch for 6 long years. He wanted nothing to do with the town, with people, or with their endless troubles. And yet, here she was, Clara Reed, daughter of the man everyone said stole silver from Buck Sawyer's mine. The same Buck Sawyer who had just sent his hired gun Rafe Cole to hunt her down like an animal. Jack slowly lowered the revolver, but he didn't holster it. "You understand what you're asking?" His voice was low, rough, like gravel under boots. "Once you say those words, there's no going back." Clara swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her bleeding shoulder. "I know," she whispered, "but I'd rather be your wife for one night than Buck Sawyer's prisoner for the rest of my life." Outside, another gunshot rang out in the distance. Closer now. Jack turned his head toward the sound, then looked back at her. Something dark and unreadable passed through his eyes. He walked to the small table, picked up a faded Bible that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and set it down in front of her. "Then we do it now," he said quietly, "before they reach this door." Clara's heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. She had come here expecting death. Instead, she was about to bind herself to a stranger who might be even more dangerous than the men chasing her. But in that moment, kneeling on the cold floor with rain still dripping from her hair and blood running down her arm, Clara Reed made the only choice she had left. And Jack Harlan, for reasons even he didn't fully understand yet, chose not to turn her away. This story is about more than survival in the lawless West. It's about 2 broken souls who discover that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is trust a stranger when the whole world wants you dead. The storm had finally quieted by dawn, but the tension inside the cabin had only grown heavier. Clara Reed stood near the cold hearth, her bandaged shoulder throbbing under the clean cloth Jack had wrapped last night. She watched him silently as he poured 2 cups of bitter coffee from the dented tin pot. He set 1 cup in front of her without a word. Then, in that same low, gravel-rough voice she had heard in the middle of the night, he spoke. 1 year. No touching. No questions about the past. Clara's fingers tightened around the warm tin cup. Her heart still raced from the memory of Rafe Cole's gunshots echoing through the rain. She nodded slowly, barely trusting her own voice. 1 year, she whispered. They rode into Silver Ridge that same morning under a gray sky. The town felt hostile eyes following them from every porch and window. At the small wooden courthouse, 2 witnesses waited: Hank Barlow, the saloon owner, and Jack's old friend, and Mrs. Eleanor Grant, the kind widow who ran the boarding house. The ceremony was painfully short. No flowers, no smiles, no promises of love or forever. Just a few stiff words from the tired justice of the peace, the scratch of a pen on paper, and it was done. Clara Reed was now Clara Harlan. When they returned to the ranch, the silence between them felt thicker than the mud still clinging to their boots. Jack carried her small bundle of belongings inside and set it on the table. He didn't look at her when he spoke. You take the bed. I'll sleep on the porch. Clara wanted to protest, but the words died in her throat. She simply nodded. That first week was a strange kind of hell. Every morning she woke before sunrise, heart pounding at the smallest sound, outside the creak of a branch or the distant whinny of a horse. Every time she heard hooves approaching the ranch, her stomach twisted with terror. Was it Buck Sawyer coming to drag her back? Was it Rafe Cole finishing what he started? She tried to be useful. She swept the cabin floor until her hands blistered. She cooked simple meals on the old iron stove beans, cornbread coffee so strong it could wake the dead. Most of it tasted like ash in her mouth, but she placed each plate in front of Jack with trembling hands. He ate everything without complaint. Yet he never spoke more than a few words. He watched her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, those steady, unreadable gray eyes following her movements across the room. Not with hunger, not with anger, just watching, as if he were trying to figure out what kind of trouble she had really brought to his door. At night, Jack spread his blanket on the wooden porch outside, rifle close at hand. Clara lay alone in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind howl across the empty land. She felt safer than she had in weeks, and yet more terrified than ever. Because safety, she was learning, came with its own kind of weight. One afternoon, Hank Barlow rode up to the ranch on his old bay mare. Dust clung to his clothes as he swung down from the saddle. Jack met him at the fence line. Clara watched from the doorway, half hidden behind the frame. I told you not to get mixed up in this, Jack Hank said, voice low but urgent. Buck Sawyer ain't the kind of man who forgets. And that girl, she's got a rope around her neck already. You sure you want that same rope around yours? Jack leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, saying nothing for a long moment. She asked for help, he finally answered. I gave her my name. That's all. Hank shook his head, worry deep in his eyes. You always did have a habit of picking up strays that bite back. Later that same evening, after Hank had ridden away, Mrs. Eleanor Grant arrived in her small wagon. She carried a covered basket smelling of fresh bread and stew. While Jack was out checking the horses, the older woman pulled Clara aside near the woodpile. She spoke softly, her voice warm like sunlight, breaking through clouds. Child, I know fear when I see it. I've buried 2 husbands and raised 3 boys alone in this godforsaken territory. But not every man out here is a monster. Mrs. Grant gently touched Clara's uninjured arm. Give it time. Some hearts are locked tighter than a bank vault. But even the strongest locks can be opened with the right key. Clara wanted to believe her. She really did. But every night when the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the same cold thought returned. This marriage was nothing but a contract, a cold, silent agreement between 2 damaged souls trying to survive. And yet, in the quiet moments when Jack thought she wasn't watching, she sometimes caught him staring toward the horizon with a look she recognized all too well. The look of a man carrying ghosts heavier than anyone knew. The weight of their unspoken pasts pressed down on the cabin like another storm gathering on the edge of the valley. And somewhere in the distance, Buck Sawyer and Rafe Cole were still out there, waiting, watching. The wind began to howl like a wounded animal long before the storm arrived. Word spread through Silver Ridge faster than wildfire. Rafe Cole had ridden into town 2 days ago, his scarred face hard as granite. He nailed a fresh wanted poster on the saloon wall, a large reward offered by Buck Sawyer himself. Clara Harlan, wanted dead or alive. The ink was still wet when Hank Barlow, now wearing the deputy's badge Buck had forced on him, stared at that poster with a sick feeling in his gut. Inside the quiet ranch cabin, the air grew thicker with every passing hour. Clara Harlan moved through her days like a ghost. She kept her head down, scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, and tried not to flinch every time a horse snorted in the corral. But fear had become her constant shadow. One night the sky cracked open. Thunder rolled across the mountains like cannon fire. Rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like stones being thrown. Clara couldn't sleep. The basket of dirty clothes in the corner had grown too full, and the thought of wearing the same blood-stained dress another day made her stomach turn. She waited until she was sure Jack was asleep on the porch. Then she slipped out the back door, a lantern in one hand, and the bundle of laundry under her arm, heading toward the swollen creek behind the cabin. The rain blinded her within seconds. Wind whipped her hair across her face as she knelt by the rushing water, scrubbing frantically. She never heard the footsteps. A dark figure emerged from the trees, rifle raised. Rafe Cole. Well, he drawled, voice cutting through the storm. Look what the rain washed up. Clara froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs so violently she thought it might burst. The lantern slipped from her fingers and hissed out in the mud. She tried to run, but her foot caught on a root. She fell hard, mud filling her mouth. Rafe laughed low and ugly, stepping closer, boots sucking in the wet earth. Then a single gunshot split the night. The bullet tore through the air just inches from Rafe's head and buried itself in the tree behind him. Rafe spun around, cursing. From the darkness near the cabin, Jack Harlan stepped forward, rain streaming down his face, revolver steady in his hand. His eyes burned with a fury Clara had never seen before. Get off my land, Jack said, voice low and deadly calm. For one heartbeat, Rafe hesitated. Then he backed away slowly into the trees, a cruel smile twisting his lips. This ain't over, Harlan. Not by a long shot. When the sound of Rafe's retreating horse finally faded, Jack lowered his gun. Clara remained on the ground, shaking uncontrollably, soaked to the bone. Jack walked over and pulled her up with one strong hand under her arm. He didn't speak as he led her back to the cabin. Inside, he lit the lantern with steady fingers, while Clara stood dripping in the middle of the room. Only then did she notice it. Jack's hand was trembling, not from cold, not from fear, from rage. He turned away quickly, setting the lantern down harder than necessary. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscles stood out like corded rope. "I didn't want this," he muttered almost to himself. "I left that life behind. The blood, the killing. I swore I'd never pick up a gun for anything but protection again." Clara hugged her arms around herself, teeth chattering. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring this to your door." Jack didn't answer right away. Later that night, after the worst of the storm had passed, Hank Barlow rode up under a dripping slicker. He looked exhausted, the deputy star heavy on his chest. "Buck's putting pressure on me, Jack," he said quietly, standing just inside the doorway. "He wants me to search this ranch. Officially. Says Clara's hiding evidence that could ruin him." Hank's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to his old friend. "I can stall him, but not forever. You need to be careful." Jack only nodded once, his face unreadable. After Hank left, the cabin fell into heavy silence once more. Clara sat near the dying fire, a blanket around her shoulders. The wound on her shoulder ached again. Memories of her father's dying words pushed into her mind, the letter he had hidden, the proof that Buck Sawyer had murdered him for the silver claim. She looked up at Jack, who was cleaning his revolver by the window. "There's a letter," she said softly, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "My father wrote it before they killed him. It proves Buck forged the deeds. It proves everything." Jack paused, rag still in his hand. He didn't ask for details. He didn't press her. Instead, he walked over and stopped a few feet away, looking down at her with those stormy gray eyes. His voice came out low, rough, and weighted with something deep and dangerous. "I gave you my word. 1 year. No questions. No touching." He took one slow breath. "But if they lay a single hand on you, I will break every promise I ever made. To them, and to myself." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara felt her chest tighten. For the first time since that stormy night she had begged at his door, she saw the man behind the silence. A man fighting his own demons. A man who was beginning to care, even when he didn't want to. Outside, the rain slowly eased into a gentle patter. But inside the cabin, a different storm was building. One that had nothing to do with thunder, and everything to do with two broken hearts learning how to trust in the darkness. "Duoi jai, la fan bon juok viet huan ching theo jung yu kao" marked down. The days after the storm carried a different kind of silence. Jack Harlan no longer slept on the porch. He stayed close to the cabin, always within earshot. One crisp morning, he walked out to the corral, carrying an old Colt revolver and a box of cartridges. Clara watched him from the doorway, her heart beating uncertainly. "You're done running," he said quietly. "Time you learned how to stand." He didn't teach her to be fast. He taught her to be steady. Every afternoon, when the sun sat low and golden over the hills, Jack stood behind her, voice low and patient, correcting the way she gripped the gun. He showed her how to read tracks in the soft earth, how a bent blade of grass could tell you which way a man had gone, and how fresh horse dung could tell you how close danger truly was. He never raised his voice, never touched her more than necessary to adjust her stance. But Clara felt the change in him. The way his eyes lingered a second longer when she hit the target for the first time. The way his shoulders lost some of their rigid tension when she practiced loading the cylinder without dropping a single round. One quiet evening, Mrs. Eleanor Grant arrived in her wagon, a worn wooden box tucked under her arm. She handed it to Clara when Jack was out checking the far fence line. "Your father gave this to me the week before he died," the older woman whispered. "He said if anything happened to him, I should get it to you. There's a letter inside, and papers about the mine. Real proof. Clara's hands trembled as she took the box. She hid it under a loose floorboard that same night, her throat tight with both hope and terror. But Buck Sawyer wasn't waiting. He called a public meeting in the center of Silver Ridge the very next week. The whole town gathered under the evening sky as Buck stood on the raised platform, voice booming with false righteousness. Clara Harlan murdered her own father for the silver claim, he shouted. She's dangerous. She's a liar. And anyone hiding her is just as guilty, the crowd murmured uneasily. Then Hank Barlow stepped forward, badge still pinned to his chest, though it now felt like a chain. I've known Jack Harlan most of my life, Hank said, voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. And I know Clara didn't kill her father. Buck Sawyer, you're the one who's been lying. You forged those deeds. You killed that man in cold blood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Buck's face twisted with rage. Before the meeting ended, he stripped Hank of his deputy badge right there in front of the entire town. You're finished, Barlow. The ride home that night felt longer than usual. Jack was returning from Silver Ridge alone, cutting across the narrow trail through the pines when the first shot rang out. Rafe Cole stepped out from behind a thick tree rifle, already smoking. The ambush was fast and brutal. Jack threw himself sideways, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. Bullets tore through the air. Bark exploded off trees. Jack felt a searing pain rip across his chest as one of Rafe's shots found its mark. He staggered but didn't fall. With blood pouring down his shirt, Jack fired back 3 precise shots. The third bullet slammed into Rafe's shoulder, spinning the hired gun around with a howl of pain. Rafe cursed violently, clutched his bleeding arm, and disappeared into the trees on his horse. Jack made it only halfway back to the cabin before his vision blurred. Clara had been waiting on the porch, worry gnawing at her, since sunset. When she saw him swaying in the saddle, blood soaking the front of his shirt, something inside her snapped. She ran. She ran straight into the open, fear forgotten, and caught Jack just as he slid from the horse. Jack. Her voice broke. Oh, God. Jack. With strength she didn't know she had, Clara half-dragged, half-carried him inside the cabin. She tore open his shirt, hands shaking as she pressed clean cloth against the ugly wound in his chest. Jack gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. I was a bounty hunter once, he rasped, voice hoarse with pain. I killed more men than I can count. Swore on my mother's grave I'd never spill blood again. But tonight, I almost broke that oath completely. Clara's tears fell onto his chest as she worked to stop the bleeding. I'm not just running from death, she whispered, voice trembling. Buck Sawyer. He threatened to sell me, to auction me off like cattle if I didn't marry him and keep quiet about the mine. That shame. It's been choking me worse than any noose. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Jack's labored breathing. Then he reached up his blood-stained hand, finding hers. He held it gently but firmly. The contract. The 1-year deal we made, he said, eyes locking onto hers with raw intensity. It ends tonight. He took a shaky breath. From now on, you're my wife for real. If you still want that. If you still want me. Clara looked down at their joined hands, one small and trembling the other. Large, calloused, and covered in blood. In that quiet, painful moment, the walls they had both built so carefully finally crumbled. The letter from the wooden box changed everything. With the proof in hand, Hank Barlow and Mrs. Eleanor Grant refused to stay silent any longer. Even without a badge, Hank rode beside Jack and Clara into Silver Ridge. Mrs. Eleanor Grant walked with her head high, carrying the faded papers like a shield. They had one chance. Buck Sawyer had called a special town meeting in the square, declaring it an official hearing to bring justice for the murder of Clara's father. The whole town gathered under the bright Wyoming sun, whispers spreading like dry grass in the wind. Buck stood on the raised platform, chest, puffed-out voice dripping with false authority. Clara Harlan is a murderer and a thief, he bellowed. She killed her own flesh and blood for silver. Any man or woman standing with her will answer to me. His hired hands moved through the crowd, glaring, trying to silence anyone who dared speak. The air felt thick with fear. Then Hank Barlow stepped forward, voice ringing clear across the square. "I've seen the letter," he said. "Buck Sawyer forged the mine deeds. He shot Clara's father in the back. These papers prove it." Gasps rose from the crowd. Buck's face turned purple with rage. He signaled his men, but before they could move, a gunshot cracked from the rooftops. Rafe Colearm, still bandaged and face twisted in pain, had climbed onto the saloon roof. He aimed straight at Clara. Time slowed. Jack Harlan saw the barrel swing toward his wife and didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, throwing his body in front of her. The bullet slammed into his left shoulder with brutal force. Jack staggered, but stayed on his feet, blood blooming across his shirt for the second time in days. Clara's heart stopped. Then something inside her ignited. She pulled the small revolver Jack had taught her to use from the folds of her dress. Her hands were steady now. No trembling. No panic. She raised the gun, took a breath exactly as he had shown her, and fired. The shot struck Rafe's shooting hand. He screamed, dropping his rifle. It clattered to the ground below as he clutched his bleeding fingers and fled across the rooftops. The square erupted in chaos. Hank Barlow and several brave townsfolk immediately stepped forward, voices rising together. "We saw the letter. Buck murdered that man. He's been stealing claims for years." The weight of truth finally crashed down on Buck Sawyer. His own men turned away from him. The crowd closed in. Within minutes, the former mayor was dragged off to the jailhouse in chains, shouting curses that no one listened to anymore. Rafe Cole was never seen in Silver Ridge again. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the storm of fear that had hung over the town for so long finally broke. That evening, Mrs. Eleanor Grant opened her boarding house for a small gathering. Lanterns glowed softly. Fresh bread and stew filled the air with warmth. Hank Barlow raised a tin cup, his voice thick with emotion. To friendship, and to justice that finally found its way home. Glasses clinked. Quiet smiles passed between weary faces. But Jack and Clara slipped away before the night grew late. He took her hand gently, deliberately, and led her out past the edge of town onto the wide silver grass prairie they both now called home. The grass swayed gently in the evening breeze, glowing golden under the setting sun. Jack stopped in the middle of the open field. He turned to face Clara, his shoulders still bandaged, pain etched in every line of his face. Yet his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself onto one knee, not like the first time, forced by desperation and rain. This time, it was different. "Clara," he said, voice rough but steady, "I gave you my name to save your life. Tonight, I want to give you my heart. For real. For as long as I breathe." He looked up at her vulnerability laid bare in the golden light. "I'm not promising an easy life. The land is hard. The memories won't vanish overnight. But I swear, I will stand beside you through every storm, if you'll have me." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks. She reached down and took both of his hands in hers. "I stopped running the night I knocked on your door," she whispered. "And I'm not afraid anymore. Not of Buck, not of the past, not of tomorrow." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, Jack. I'll have you. Today. Tomorrow. For the rest of our lives." Jack rose slowly. He pulled her close carefully because of his wounds, and for the first time they held each other without fear, without contracts, without walls. As the sun sank lower, painting the silver grass in shades of rose and gold, they stood side by side, looking out over the land they had fought for and protected together. Two broken souls who had found their way to healing. Two hearts that had learned the hardest truth of the frontier. Justice doesn't always come from the fastest gun. Sometimes, it begins with one quiet, desperate oath in the rain, and the courage of two wounded people brave enough to trust again. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.